So, all right, guys, I want to make a quick video about a perception that many people may have about black women that you may not have thought about before. I think a lot of people don't really realize this when it comes to femininity or perceived femininity, right? There's a lot of conversation about how black women seem to have a more aggressive mentality. A lot of black women seem to be angry. There's tons of conversations in that area, a lot of them, right? So it may or may not be true for an individual. But this is what we're talking about is perception, right? Doesn't necessarily make it a fact. And if it is a fact, doesn't necessarily mean it's a fact in all situations. But we're talking about perception, right? So it's common for people to think that black women come off as less feminine because they are perceived to be more aggressive in nature. But why is that? Right? I made a bunch of videos about physicality. You may or may not have watched them. If you have not watched them, I would encourage you to do so. But this is factual data, factual statistics, government-derived statistics. Medical professionals provided these statistics having to do with the physicality of men, women of all races in the United States. Something interesting that we see here is that when it comes to men, black men and white men tend to be the largest. The difference between the two is very minimal, right? It's minimal. But those two categories of men tend to be the largest, followed by Latinos and Mexicans, and then lastly, Asians. Typically, an Asian man is a lot smaller than a black man or a white man, all right? Keep that in mind. Now, as far as women are concerned, typically, or on average, may not always be the case. So, I understand you may know a very large Hispanic woman or a very large Asian woman. It might exist. You might know some of them personally. But on average, right, when it comes to women, black women and white women seem to be the largest, just like as with men, followed by Latinos, Mexican women, followed lastly by Asian women. But there's something interesting that happens here. Right? When it comes to height, black women, white women, very close. Right? You can see the data on this in the other videos. I will put links in the description box, and I will also put links. They'll pop up on the video when the video plays. Right? But this is where it gets really interesting. When we go to weight between black women and white women, on average, black women weigh about 20 pounds more. It's about 20 pounds more on average. When we go into the other races, that increases a lot. So as a result, when you look at all of this data, there's one thing that we see that people may not really consider that much, is that the difference between size and weight between a black man and a black woman is significantly less than it is between a white man and a white woman. On average, white women are a lot smaller than the corresponding man. Right? Not necessarily just with height. Height, the difference between black and white is pretty much similar, but it's the weight. And then as we look at Latinos and Mexicans, and we look at Asians, that difference increases more substantially. So what does this mean? What this means is, by far, on average, black women are bigger than white women, Hispanic women, Mexican women, Asian women. They're larger. We know, and I'm speaking as a man, typically men like to be larger than their woman. They like to be bigger. And we know that men tend to like smaller women, petite women, right? We know that's very, very common, right? So why is that? Because it's a perception of femininity. When we think about a feminine woman, we think petite, we think smaller, we think dainty. These are all the things psychologically that are embedded, either through society or some of it is just nature. Right? It's a combination of the two. Now, a couple of things I need to point out. One is that It doesn't necessarily mean that just because a woman's bigger, she's less feminine. But it does mean that a woman who's bigger can be perceived as less feminine. I know for a fact, I have some larger women in my family who are, they're typically a lot larger than the average woman. Not like gross or ridiculously obese, nothing like that, but just larger. You know, they're what we call thick, right? But some of them are very feminine in their personality and how they act, right? And they have no problem attracting a man. But if you couple the size difference along with an aggressive attitude, you're going to have a problem. Men are gonna find it less feminine, and in some cases, maybe even threatening. I'll be honest with you. I'll tell you a story about myself growing up. You may think this is a good thing. You may think this is a bad thing. You may think it messed me up. I don't care. I'm just going to lay it out like it was. My father was in the military. So we traveled around the world. When I grew up, I lived in Germany for 3 years. I lived in Italy for 3 years. Lived in different states around the country, right? But Florida was always home. So when my father was on leave, we'd always came home to Florida. This is what's interesting. Being around different cultures, different personalities. Um, it was a mishmash. The military is a mixture. But we all know that people, when they mix, they tend to be on their best or a different behavior. This is common, right? This is how people get along. That you take all these different frequencies, and when they come together, they kind of, merge, and they create an environment where everybody can, for the most part, get along, right? So this may seem minor, but when I remember being a young man, or not a boy, being little, and coming back to Florida, and the environment just changing. Instead of being surrounded by people of all races, I was surrounded by primarily black people, just black folks. And we all know in black communities there's a different culture. Some people may not understand it. At that time, there was a lot of things that I didn't understand because I didn't grow up immersed into it. One thing I noticed, and this is not trying to be negative or say anything bad about anyone, but I noticed that the women, the black women, tended to be louder. It's a cultural thing. They were louder. They were more what I perceived as aggression, but ultimately was love. Come here, boy, give me a hug. Grab you, hug you, and stuff like that. To me, that felt aggressive, right? But it wasn't aggressive in nature at all. It was love. They were happy to see me. They loved me, but it was a perception. Again, it was a perception. So this is one of the things I think is really interesting. I think it's worth giving some thought. I'd love to hear what your opinion of this is in the comment section. We've got the facts, we've got opinion, and we've got perception, general perception. I believe that's one of the reasons that black women are perceived, and in some cases they are, but in most cases are perceived to be more aggressive. I think along with the perceived attitudes, how it's interpreted, and along with the factual attitudes, a lot of things that people have experienced in their dealings with black women, but also physicality, the image, the physical image. Just because a black woman tends to be larger doesn't mean that she's actually less feminine, but it could be perceived that way. Anxious to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comment section below. Till next time, peace.